All right, we are live. Thank y'all for tuning in tonight to another RDU Buzz, where we talk about all things real estate, recreation, and restaurants in the Raleigh-Durham area. I have an embarrassing admission to make. I forgot to charge my computer right before this, so I'm running on some pretty not too low battery, but low enough that I'm gonna have to keep an eye on it as we go. So I've done these since, gosh, I think we started doing these in October of last year. So almost 8 months now, and have yet to forget to charge my computer until tonight. So if I have to cut this short because of that, I apologize. But as folks come in, make sure to put in the comments where you are joining from. It just helps us as we curate content to put into these, and know where folks are watching from, so we know what to talk about. So hopefully these are helpful to you all. Um, Tonight we are going to dig primarily into the housing market. So we may get into some other things, but primarily we're going to be looking at the housing market, and some updated data that I think is really fascinating. Um, and I think will be hopefully helpful to those of you who are looking to buy in the near future, or who are looking to sell in the near future. Um, so I'm gonna break it down, and this is like, I mean, June is always a good time to talk about the housing market in general, simply because you're at the mid-year point. So you've got enough data to kind of know how the year is going to go. You can kind of project out what the rest of the year is going to look like. And so that's essentially what we're going to do tonight. We're going to dig into the data. We're going to start with really what it's looking like on the mortgage side of things, because obviously that's going to drive the market. That's the big driver. And then we're going to dig into what's happening nationally, just for a little bit, and then we're going to dig into what we're seeing on the local level. And not to get too ahead of myself, but we are seeing the market appear to be slowing down, and this is something that I've been noticing on the ground for a bit. For several months, especially the beginning of the year. Um, it was really challenging to get someone under contract without having to compete in a multiple offer situation. We're starting to see, and we've seen for the last month and a half, situations where getting folks under contract without being a part of a bidding process has become a little more common. So we're going to dig into all of that tonight. But as you're joining in, make sure to put in the comments where you are joining from. And again, for those of you just tuning in, my battery on my computer is low, so I'm going to be probably restricted by that. I apologize. This is an embarrassing thing to admit. But anyway, so let's dig in. So with mortgage rates, Fannie Mae actually came out with an interesting projection of what they think mortgage rates are going to do. And I'm going to pull this up and share this on the screen. Here we go. All right, there we go. I know I can't ever tell how easy it is for y'all to see my shared screen, or if it's really challenging, but I'll read it out nonetheless. So these are the revised projections from Fannie Mae. I always tell folks with these projections in general, take them with a grain of salt. Rarely are these things correct. However, typically they are not correct by being too much on the low end. Hopefully that is not the case here, because these are much higher projections than what we had originally seen Fannie Mae put out. So I'll focus on the last projection of 2024. So if you look at 2024, they have 2024.4, so quarter four of 2024, the latter part of this year. They are now projecting a 7% interest rate. So to put that into perspective, Fannie Mae had originally projected a 6.4% interest rate at the end of the year. So we're talking a little bit more than half a point higher by the end of this year than what they had originally expected. So that's quite a bit. That's quite a bit of a jump. And in the real estate world, and depending on how closely y'all follow this, in the real estate world, we had heard a lot of what they call the year of the fives, right? That and one of those fives was going to be 5% interest rates, that rates were going to get back into the fives. It does not look like that is going to happen this year. And I think a reasonable person has seen that for a while, that interest rates are not coming down that low anytime soon. And Fannie Mae, with these projections, is starting to acknowledge that as well. So we had thought, or they had thought, mid to low sixes by quarter four of 2024. Right now, we're looking at 7. So, which is right where we are today. So, if you look at interest rates today, they're right around the 7% mark. So, essentially, Fannie Mae is saying there's not going to be a whole lot of change between what you see today and what you see towards the end of the year. To take that even further, if you go into 2025, by the end of 2025, they're expecting 6.6. So they're not even expecting rates to be as low as they thought they would be this year by the end of next year. And so again, it's much more of a gradual decrease of rates is what Fannie Mae is expecting. Their original projections for 2025, just put this in perspective, I believe was 6%. So again, a little more than 0.5% difference between where they thought they would be and now where they think they're going to be. So all this kind of put into perspective with rates where they are. Rates increased to the 7% range really early April, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. I know it was in the April timeframe, and they've really hung there ever since. And I just checked them today, mortgage rates daily, and it was right at 7% as well. And so Fannie Mae saying they're going to hold tight there for a really long time. So obviously, that is a huge driver when it comes to the housing market. What do interest rates look like? Another driver of that is home prices. So there was an interesting study that was put out. And before I get to that, Need Help said, watching from Lillington, North Carolina. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. Lillington's not too far away. So there was an interesting study that was put out by Redfin. And they determined, this was back in April, they determined, and this is a pretty astounding number, that 40% of homeowners could not afford the same home that they own today if they were to buy it today. So 40% of homeowners could not afford the exact same home they're living in right now and that they own right now if they were to buy it today. And so that just goes to show the unaffordability that is in the market, whether it's prices, interest rates, combination of both, which it is, that is driving a lot of what we have seen in the housing market. Now, what's been interesting this year so far is how competitive the housing market has been in spite of all of that, because interest rates have really been, I know since April they topped 7%, but even before April, they weren't great. I mean, you can kind of follow this chart here and they weren't, I mean, they weren't anything to write home about. The rates were in the sixes. I mean, this is pulling from Monday, January 29th, and the 30-year fix was 6.8. So even though they're above 7 now, they weren't great before April. And so all year though, we've seen the market really work well, even with high interest rates. I think we are reaching a point where the market is starting to run out of steam. And we're seeing that on the national side, and we're also starting to see that on the local side. So we'll get into some of the national data here, which is really fascinating. Let me check my battery life here. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to keep checking my battery life as we go tonight. Make sure this doesn't cut off on me midway through a statement. So the national housing market, there's some pretty interesting statistics on here. So mortgage applications, which are essentially a future predictor of what the market will look like, continue to be really weak. Obviously, if mortgage applications are low, then demand is going to reflect that in the future. National inventory levels were 30. Now I'm talking this week compared to this week last year. So this week this year compared to this week last year, national inventory levels are 30% higher this week than they were this time last year at the same time. As that tells us on a national level, inventory is starting to build up, which is really fascinating. And this chart right here shows us a little bit about that. So inventory is always a really good indicator of the market, right? If inventory is building, then in theory that means that demand is starting to cool off a little bit. And what's been fascinating this year is we've seen such a surge in new listings. So, more folks are listing their homes this year than they did last year by double digit margins most months here in our area specifically. Yet inventory has remained down because buyer demand has been so strong in the first half of this year that's been gobbling up all of those new listings and keeping inventory levels down. We're starting to see that change. We'll get into those statistics here in a second. But nationally, it's starting to change as well. Sorry, Cindy just walked in here. I didn't know. Are you joining us?
Yeah.
Oh, I had no idea. Let me scoot over. Can you get by? You want to come this way?
Yeah, I just don't know how to get this.
Sorry, this is a really awkward transition. You need a chair.
I thought you were giving me this.
Oh.
Hi, everybody. Oh, that's awesome. Earl just made it to Nightdale today from Massachusetts. That's so cool.
All right. Well, thanks for bearing with us during that. I'm glad you're here. I had no idea you were going to be joining tonight. And now you broke your microphone. Yeah. And you're going to make fun of me. So I've had to tell everybody my battery, I forgot to charge my computer, so we're at 33% and it's been decreasing very rapidly. So the amount of time we have tonight is solely based on the battery life on the computer. So
we're very well prepared.
Yeah. Anyway, so what we were talking about before Cindy so rudely interrupted us and decided to join the live tonight out of nowhere, was national inventory levels. We were talking about how inventory levels in general are just an indicator of the market and buyer demand. Because if inventory is building, then that means there's more sellers obviously listing their homes and folks are buying homes, and so it's an indicator of where the market's headed. And if you look at this map that's on the screen, you will see that between May of 2023 and May of this year, so 1 year difference, this year, last year, North Carolina as a whole is up 41% of inventory levels. And you look, Carlson, this map's actually really fascinating. We have some clients who live in Florida, and they're dealing with what's going on in Florida, which is more akin to like a buyer's market. And you see that here, 70% more inventory in Florida.
That's crazy.
May of 2024 than May of 2023.
Wow.
Which is wild.
Wow. Yeah, that's crazy. That's like so much higher than all the other states on the map.
Yeah. I won't fix your microphone because that's really bothering me.
Yeah.
You just talk.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. And then, I mean, most states are obviously have much higher inventory. So it's interesting to see like Nevada over there with 25%, saying that it had a big correction in 2022. So I guess that's why, but that's really interesting. Really interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, on the national level, we're seeing inventory increase for the most part. Obviously, there's an exception to that. But what's another thing that's happening on the national level, and this is another fascinating thing. So this is a really cool website. Resi Club puts out some really interesting data. And of course, it's updating. But Lance Lambert did an article talking about how many homes are selling this year compared to past years. And obviously, that's also an indicator of the health of the market. How many people are buying and selling real estate? Because real estate in general is a really large, I think it is the largest contributor to the GDP, to the national economy.
Right.
And last year was a low point. So this graph's really interesting. So 4.1 million transactions happened in 2023, which was the lowest point that had been since the crisis, the great crash of
since the year 2008.
2008.
Yeah, that's wild.
The projection is 2024 will also be 4.1. So absolutely no improvement on how many people are buying and selling real estate in 2024. And it's going to take us to 2027 before we're even going to get to 4.5. And so we're still not going to be at the number of transactions that were taking place prior to COVID anytime soon.
Yeah, it's crazy.
According to Goldman Sachs. And
it's an interesting graph too, because I feel like during COVID, it felt like everybody was moving. So you would, when you're, because, it was like this whole crisis, I feel like, of like competitive housing market across the country. So it's interesting to see how few people moved. But at the same time, that's how few people were able to get in, but not necessarily how many were like trying to participate. So that's very, very interesting.
It is. And to put 4.1 into perspective even more, in 1978, 4 million people, there were 4 million home sales in 1978, and the population was 223 million. In 2024, there's going to be 4.1. So hardly any improvement compared to 1978. And the population's added 100 million people.
Yeah. That's
and
crazy.
so the national housing market, all of this data points to the national housing market starting to see a slowdown. Another interesting data point that I don't have a graph of is price drops, right? So price drops are another indicator of where the market is. So 35% of the homes on the market last week nationally dropped their price. 35%. I mean, that's a substantial number.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot of price dropping for sure.
To put that in perspective, last year, this same time was 30%. So it's a 5% gain this year. And I believe, if I remember correctly, 2022 was 20 something percent. So it's obviously a substantial gain since 2022 as well. So we're starting to see nationally more price drops, and we're seeing inventory starting to build across the country. So obviously, this is a show about the Raleigh-Durham area. So what is happening in the Raleigh-Durham market? That's ultimately what we like to talk about. So the beauty of these lives. So we actually did a video on the housing market yesterday, right? We filmed it yesterday.
Yes, yeah. So I
think it'll be out next week.
Yeah, that'll hit next Tuesday on our channel. So if you want like a more in-depth of the full housing market, you can definitely check the full edited one where I'm not walking in the middle and causing trouble.
But the beauty of doing this on the live, and the reason we do it on the live and on the other one is like 11 minutes. So it's kind of bite-sized compared to this. But this allows us to actually share the data points, share the graphs, walk through the graphs. And so I think it's a much more in-depth way to kind of dig into what the housing market is looking like. So this graph right here is the entire triangle. And I'll split this up here in a second between the areas. But when you look at, there's really two numbers or two terms to look at. One is homes for sale. So how many homes are on the market right now, this very second? That's really what you think of when you think of inventory. What is your total inventory? That's a set number. Another way you can look at it is months worth of supply. So that essentially means if no one listed their home, how long would it take to run through the active homes on the market right now? Like how long would it take you to work through that? That's another indicator of inventory, but it's a little different because it's factoring in buyer demand into that. Whereas just active homes is just, I mean, it's just a set number. So if you look at both of these homes for sale, the whole triangle inventory wise is up roughly a little over 9% from this year to last year. So we're seeing inventory higher at this point, 9% higher than where we were at this point last year. And if you look at month supply, it actually follows pretty closely. It doesn't always follow this closely, but it follows pretty closely at 9.5% increase. So that tells me in the month of May, we saw a significant increase of inventory in our market, which if you look at where May has been in other parts of it, with the exception 2022 is kind of an odd exception, but May typically isn't where you start to see this drastic increase of inventory in the market, and we're starting to see it this year. That tells me that I think the market is entering a place that for probably the remainder of this year will be more buyer friendly. That's my guess. That's my projection. I think we're entering a time where the market will become more buyer friendly.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, definitely, I think days on market are going to be longer. As in by buyer friendly, we don't mean that it's a buyer's market. I think it's going to continue to probably stay a seller's market, just because these inventory levels, though higher, are still almost half of what they were before the pandemic and the normal times. BC, before COVID. So, we still have a lot of people obviously moving into this area. So I think it's still going to continue to be competitive in some situations, but not as much so as it has been in like the past few months since January. I think that this might be a time where it's a little easier to hopefully not have to get into necessarily like a huge bidding war. But definitely still a time where I don't think we'll see like massive price dropping, but I think we'll at least see a little more negotiating going on between the parties than we have been able to see this year so far.
Yeah. And that's a really good point. And so Cindy hit on something that's worth talking about. She said about like prices not dropping and inventory levels being at a place that is still below of where they were prior to the pandemic. And that's a really important point. So sometimes folks will ask us, what about prices? What about where are prices going to go? And I think it's pretty much accepted within the real estate world that prices are going to remain stable and even increase depending on your market over the next several years, even though transactions are low, inventory is increasing. And there's an important reason why, and Cindy hit it, and there's a graph that shows us. This graph right here compares May of 2019, so our last normal market was essentially 2019, to May of 2024. And with the exception of Texas is the only one that is above pre-pandemic levels for inventory. Everybody else is still below pre-pandemic levels. I mean, you look at North Carolina, we're still, even though inventory is increasing, we're still 37% lower than we were May of 2019, which is substantial.
Yeah.
And so
in 2019, it was still a competitive market here. It was nothing like it is, these days. Like the pandemic really shook things out quite a bit, but it was still a time where almost every house still had a multiple offer situation, but it was more like, is the winner going to be $3,000 over, $5,000 over? Whereas during the pandemic, it was like, is it $50,000 over or $100,000 over?
Yeah.
Which is ridiculous, but that was just the case. But, even with those higher numbers, it was still competitive in Raleigh with the amount of movement kind of happening. But obviously interest rates were lower, so it was a little easier to part with your current house and your current interest rate and move into something that was probably a similar rate. Whereas now no one wants to let go of their 3%, interest rate, then trade it for like a 7. That's a tough pill to swallow when also the home prices are almost doubled what they were in 2018, 2019.
Yeah. And so I know that graph said 37% decrease, or 37% lower than we were in 2019. But if you look at our market, it's really, it's substantially different. We're nowhere near that 37% mark. We're like half the inventory. And you can see it here. So in Cary, May of 2019 in Cary, there were 627 homes for sale in Cary. In May of 2024, there's 180.
That's crazy.
So even though inventory is increasing, we're still nowhere near what we were pre-pandemic levels. So when folks ask, well, what about prices? Are prices going to come down? And we say, probably not. This is why, ultimately, because the inventory levels just don't exist for that to necessarily happen. You might minimize competition, but for the most part, the market's still going to move at a clip that allows prices to remain stable.
Yeah,
and
and
increase.
And in no field do prices start to magically, you might have like a little small dip or something, but I think that people hold on to this hope that now it's just going to go back to where you can find a starter home for $200,000. I mean, we're just past that point, with inflation. It's not like all of a sudden all these people that did buy houses in the last 4 years are going to be willing to sell their house for half of what they paid for it. You might not see that like sharp increase the way we did, but I don't think they're just like going to go back to being valued like half of what they were paid for. So, I mean, I think the prices are what the prices are. And we just hope that there's not as much of a rise in appreciation. I mean, you want a little bit, obviously, but hopefully it's not anything like it was in the early 2020s during those years. That was a lot.
And to kind of ratchet this down some, because obviously, we just talked about how local inventory is up roughly 9% as far as triangle wide. But when you pull that down even further, so now I've got on the screen, I've got Raleigh, I've got Cary, I got Durham, I got Chapel Hill. Again, I don't know if y'all can see on your end, but I'll give you the numbers. Or I obviously know you can see. I don't know how big it is on y'all's screen, but so the inventory in Raleigh is up 33%. So obviously that's a big difference between like when you look at 9% triangle wide, it's like, oh, it's not a huge difference. Raleigh's 33%. And this is for resale. So I pulled out new construction on this because really when you think of the competitive market, you really just think of resale. At least I do, because new construction is what it is.
Yeah. And someone actually just asked, do you find the new construction market remaining stable? I think it's definitely stable. It's just a totally different procedure, I guess, of like getting a house. Most of the builders, you walk in, and if you're the next in line, then you're the next in line. Whereas on the resale market, it hits and everybody sees it at once, and then it kind of becomes like a bidding war in some cases. So it's just a different process. So that's why we took it out.
And where new construction becomes difficult is the pre-sale route. So if you want to build your home, that's where it can become challenging. That's where we've seen the competitiveness this year exist. If you're just open to like, an inventory home or a spec home, the competition typically is not there. But if you want to build the home from scratch, pick out the lot, the floor plan, the finishes, all those kind of things,
which most people reasonably
which most people do
prefer, obviously.
I've seen that's where the wait lists are. That's where sometimes the bidding on the lots is.
Yeah, there are some builders that will do that. Yeah. Especially at the beginning of this year. I haven't seen it as much like in May, but it just depends neighborhood by neighborhood. But it's definitely a stable market. And I know at least in April, I haven't checked it for May, I think about almost like 30 to 40% of the active inventory in the triangle was new construction. So there's definitely an ample amount of it to choose from. So if you're moving to the area and you're open to new construction, that definitely can open up some doors for you.
Yeah. So, but for this purpose, just kind of thinking about like the competitive market. Typically, when you think of a competitive market, you're really just kind of thinking of the resale, because new construction bidding wars do exist, but most of the communities I've seen are more of like a wait list type situation than necessarily a bidding war. So when you look at resale inventory and what it looks like in May of 2024 versus May of 2023, Raleigh's up 33%, Cary's up 61%.
That is wild.
Which is crazy.
Yeah. Because I still feel like there's not that much available in Cary. Right? Like it gets swooped off really quickly. As far as like the markets we're looking at here, I'd say Cary is generally the more competitive one. So it is wild to see that number that high.
Yeah, Durham's up 8.8%, so basically 9%. That's by far the lowest one as far as inventory.
And that's kind of the average for the whole area. Yeah. So that's interesting.
Yeah. And Chapel Hill is up 37%. So also a huge increase. So obviously, if you look at triangle wide, you're like, 9% is not a crazy increase, but you look at these areas individually, and that's why I love doing this on the live. It gives us the ability to do this. it's completely different. So these areas, I mean, Carrie, a 61% difference in inventory, May of 2024 versus May of 2023. I mean that's substantial.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Definitely.
and it's kind of early. You know, I mean, you could put some of this on seasonality to a degree, but you know, like this is still like May's still a hot month.
Yeah,
Like it's by
definitely.
no means a September or
Right.
October.
Yeah.
Um and so it's kind of early in the year for me to say this is the seasonality of the market. I feel like it's just more driven by interest rates and affordability issues, because at some point there's just there you know there's like there's give and take, but at
Mhm.
some point that doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
So
Right. Yeah, and Mike said Raleigh is obviously overpriced. It can feel that way sometimes, but it definitely, when you look at that average price point of Raleigh compared to Chapel Hill or Cary, you might change your opinion.
yeah,
Um,
there, I mean there's some, I was talking to somebody from the Northeast the other day, and you know they were like they're from they're from a really nice area, and um this guy was like, I you know the same price of home I get here is what Cary is. And so I think, like, especially, you know, you talk about prices, especially the Cary market for a lot of folks who are moving into the area, like Cary, I mean, Cary's a sticker shock, because you think you're moving here and it's going to
and
be
you're
more
gonna find something
affordable.
cheaper.
And there are areas that are going to be more
Definitely.
affordable than the
Yeah.
market you're moving from, for a lot of folks, not, you know, depending on where you're
Right.
moving from.
Right.
But
If you're moving
um,
from Kansas, probably not.
yeah, but like,
Yeah.
you know, but Cary, I mean, Cary and Apex, like they're and Chapel Hill, like those are going to be
Ooh,
sticker
yeah.
shocks for
Yeah.
folks.
For sure.
So,
For sure.
but I think all of this data to me points to a market that is softer for the remainder of the year. I think it points to a market um, where buyers are going to have more leverage than what they had in January, February, March, April. And I think ultimately that's a good thing. And it's, you know, sellers aren't going to be happy about it, but at the end of the day, most sellers are still going to get a pretty good price for their home. It
Yeah.
just won't be a multiple offer price for their home.
Yeah, yeah. And Crystal said, I'm wondering if that's why Cary and Chapel Hill have the higher inventory percent
It could
increases.
be, yeah.
I mean, yeah, it could be. So kind of looking at months supply, blocking me here a little bit, but in May of 2024, we had Cary about a month and Chapel Hill about 2 months. That's pretty considerable. And if we get back to May of 23, it's definitely a lot lower than. So there is it's
Yeah.
sitting for longer for sure. Most of what I don't know about Chapel Hill off the top of my head, but most of what's coming in Cary is being absorbed back pretty quickly. It's just a hot area that people, especially relocating, people like to move into. But it could be partly due to prices. Obviously, not everybody can afford. Averages in Cary tend to be more like around the 700 mark, and Chapel Hill even a little higher than that. So having those higher price point, obviously you weed out a lot of people. So it makes sense.
Yeah. And I mean, the percentages of increase for the month supply, Raleigh's 46%, Cary's 50%, Durham's 28%, and Chapel Hill's 40%. So obviously that factors, like month supply, like I mentioned earlier, that factors in demand
Yeah.
into that equation. And so that can be a little more of, I guess, of a fluid way of defining inventory, because demand's not something that's the same. So you're factoring that into
for
it.
sure.
So
For sure.
but yeah, it'll be interesting to see. But all in all, I think for the housing market, I think probably positive news. I think,
Yeah, I
from
think for most buyers,
affordability.
it's positive.
Yeah.
It's not, from an affordability standpoint, it's still tough because we
And I
can't
think
do anything
even,
about interest rates, and
yeah,
the prices are not going down per se. But it helps that you hopefully won't have to get into a bidding war and pay that much
Yeah.
above what, is already kind of the listed price. So
Yeah.
that's what we're hoping for.
And I think even for sellers, because I mean, like most sellers are also buyers.
Yeah.
And so
not everybody leaves the area or starts to rent.
Yeah.
Most people are like, I want to take my equity and buy something else. So,
Exactly.
kind of kicks you on one side, but benefits you on the other. And I think at the end of the day, I think it would be less stressful to have the easier buying situation.
Yeah. So I mean, it's not all doom and gloom for sellers, because prices are holding stable and you're able to sell your home. It's not going to be for, the multiple offers potentially that it would have been several months ago. But you're going to be able to sell your home. You're going to be able to make a good profit, and you're going to be able to go on the buy side and not have to hopefully do multiple offers on that side. But my advice, and we'll end the housing segment with this. I guess we'll just end tonight with this. But my advice to buyers has been, it's going to be house dependent. Like your home search is going to be house dependent. There are going to be homes that are going to go multiple offer. And if you want to get that house, you're going to have to compete for it. And I think that's probably going to be true no matter what the market is. There's always going to be a home that's really well kept in a great area in the neighborhood you want to live in, that everyone else wants to live in, and you're going to have to compete for that house.
Right.
But I think there's also going to be a growing number of homes that you don't have to do that with, where you have a little bit of leverage to get better terms on that home.
Yeah, which will be nice, because I think, back in the pandemic, and even last year, earlier last year, not in the fall, it could be a little frustrating to see like a bidding war go on a house that you've got to go in and spend like $30,000 just to get it to be move-in ready. You're like, how am I getting in a bidding war with a house that needs new flooring, needs new paint, needs updating? So I think the houses that have been maintained well, I think those sellers will receive their reward on the back end. And the people that aren't maintaining and not updating, I think those are the ones that are gonna potentially, have a harder time selling fast. I think they're still going to sell, but, it's just going to be what you would kind of expect. Like the shinier product should probably sell faster, right?
Yeah. And my advice for sellers has been, listen, your neighbor may have sold in February with 5 offers and in 48 hours. But we're entering a new market where that may not be the reality. And so it's just more of kind of like a reality check for that.
I think it'll probably, and I think this is who would benefit the most from this would be a seller who's selling a starter home and then moving up, where they're selling something that's below the average price. Like let's say, like if the average price in Cary is in the 7s and you have a smaller, maybe needs a little fixing up starter home that's like in the 5s, like that's going to go really quickly. And then you could move into something that's more like maybe a little bit above that, and then you don't have as much competition. So there are certain scenarios where I think some people are going to benefit on both ends of that, on the buying and selling side. But obviously, if you are you don't have a starter home to sell, it might take a little longer to sell. But I think this will be good for first time buyers.
Absolutely. Sure. Cool. Well, that is all that we have tonight. I appreciate y'all tuning in. I have 16% battery left. I'm really proud of my computer.
We made it.
I was legitimately nervous that halfway through this, I was going to have to end it.
Well, you exhausted, but when I showed up, I gave it some relief.
Oh, whatever.
It was tired of only having you.
Yeah. and I'm glad you joined. These are much better when you're on here, I think. So anyway, I appreciate y'all tuning in tonight. Hope y'all have a good rest of, do you have anything else to say before I end it?
No, cool. Thank you. And then just have a few comments on there. People saying it'll be interesting to see how the summer fall market will be, for sure. Really interested to see what kind of happens as we lead into seasonally a slower time, typically in the fall. And Crystal said interesting content. Thank you. And Earl said have a great night. Thank you guys for your kind words. I appreciate y'all tuning in. For tuning in. And if you're watching this replay later, still let us know where you're watching from. Kind of helps us curate the content of it. And we just love seeing where people are watching from. So interesting. But perfect. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next week.
Thank y'all. Bye, y'all.